I'd like to introduce now the third speaker, Deborah Hall from the Casuarina Coastal Reserve LandcareGroup. Her title, as you can see, is Casuarina Coastal Reserve LandcareGroup, where forest, fire and weed meets land carers. The Landcare Group formed nearly about 25 years ago, something like that. So welcome very much, Deborah.
Right. I was wondering if there's any birdos in the audience who know what this bird is. It is a Rufus Owl. It's actually a juvenile Rufus Owl, and it was photographed not far from one of our revegetation sites. You can imagine how excited we were. My bird app describes the Rufus Owl as a richly coloured tropical owl, and I think the bird does a great job of showing us how richly coloured it is. This fellow lives with his parents in Casuarina Coastal Reserve, and it's just one illustration of the natural values of the place that we do land care in. So I'll start by talking about the reserve and some of its values. Casuarina Coastal Reserve is a narrow coastal strip of bush, approximately 1,360 hectares, and it's right beside Darwin's northern suburbs. This map is a little old. Since the map was made, several areas have been filled in and are now residential areas. Those sort of new suburbs that have popped up everywhere around Australia where you could hop from one roof to another. There's very little garden, there's a lot of cement, there's a lot of glass, and the bush has been removed. The bush that is being removed is woodland, one of the probably most threatened plant communities we have locally. It seems to be the most attractive for building houses on. And, you know, coming from John Winowski's talk, you know, it's a place where there's mature trees and nesting hollows. So it's always tragic to see that get mowed down. As a group, we've done things like try and plead with developers to have their parks where the mature trees are and leave those. But, you know, the houses seem to take precedence. Casuarina Coastal Reserve is the most visited park in the Northern Territory. You'd probably be aware that Darwin's population is something like 150,000 people. Casuarina Coastal Reserve gets 1 million visits a year, over 1 million visits a year. So you can imagine some of the people pressure on this narrow strip of bushland. I'll just see if I can run this. So down here is Rapid Creek. So this is Casuarina Coastal Reserve running all the way up here and then over along the front there. And this is a management zone, which is often seen as being part of Casuarina Coastal Reserve. You might wonder about these scrapes here. That's land owned by the Lee Point Resort there, and that's ready for a golf course. This suburb has now been finished and is fully occupied. Over here is a suburb now. This area here is earmarked for a suburb by Defence, and so is this area here. So we have a very narrow coastal strip. Another little reference to an earlier talk in the conference, Auntie Billawara Lee talked about significant sites, and actually I missed my first paragraph. I'd like to pay my respects to the Larrakia people on whose land we stand today and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I got too distracted by the owl. So very important to pay my respects there, thank you. Darabinurri resides on an island which is visible at low tide. So a really important dreaming story for Larrakia people, and this reserve has considerable natural and cultural values. The Larrakia people have looked after it for many thousands of years and maintain a strong connection to this place. People still come to the reserve to fish, collect and eat food from the bush and the sea. So you might be wandering through Casuarina Coastal Reserve and you'll see a pile of long bums, which is a particular shellfish that you find in the mangroves. People have collected those, they've cooked them up, they've enjoyed them, and, you know, had a tasty feed. The place has a continuing strong connection for people. Plant communities in the reserve include eucalypt woodland, coastal dune vegetation, monsoon vine forest, rainforest, paperbark swamps and mangroves. So there's a lot packed in there. Significant areas of this reserve have been degraded and disturbed over recent decades. Cyclone Tracy, which we all remember, was followed by the removal of sand and topsoil from the dunes. That meant that patches of forest disappeared from the coastline. Buffel grass was introduced to stabilise the sand. Buffel doesn't belong here. There's been repeated uncontrolled late fires that have favoured the spread of large grasses such as the annual mission grass, the centris, and more recently gamba. And both of these have greatly increased the risk of fire to the remaining native vegetation. Many people come to Casuarina Coastal Reserve for their recreation. They come for walking, they come for bird watching, picnicking, watching the sunset, mountain bike riding. There's a fair collection of mountain bike trails in the northern end of the park, and even swimming. Not a lot of people swim. I do in the dry season. I always take my vinegar with me, but it's a very pleasant experience that I'd recommend. Casuarina Coastal Reserve is a habitat and increasingly a refuge for insects, mammals, birds and amphibians. These species include some that are critically endangered, such as the eastern curlew and the great knot. Migratory birds that breed in the far northern hemisphere, like places like Siberia, the eastern coast of China, and Wrangel Island in the Bering Straits. They feed on the mudflats in Darwin Harbour. As locals would know, we've got a tidal variation of about 7 metres. I was travelling across the Great Australian Bight a few years ago and got to visit the Airbird Observatory, and I asked about the tidal variation. They talked to me in terms of centimetres, and I couldn't get my head around it because I'm used to metres, 7 metres. So at Leigh Point, which is on the northern end of the coastal reserve, it's possible to see thousands of migratory shorebirds at certain times of the year when they pass through Darwin on their way north or south. The land, this Casuarina Coastal Reserve, is managed by the Northern Territory Government, Parks and Rangers Branch, and I'm speaking today as a representative of the Landcare Group. We've been working to protect and enhance the natural values of this place since the 1990s. The Landcare Group works closely with the Rangers, and we've got a memorandum of understanding with them. A little bit about the purpose and the aspirations of our group. We work intensively at 2 sites in the reserve. One is in the dunes and the other is sited between a paperbark swamp, a monsoon vine forest, a deciduous forest and mangroves. So that second one was a big pretty random planting to see what we can do. On the left is the spot that was cleared. On the right is a little window into the coastal dunes that we're working in. Both of those, so on the left was a cleared area of dried grass in the dry season, and in the wet season it would have been weedy grasses. On the right would have been dominated by mission grass. The trees, the shrubs, the pandanus that you see would not have been there. So we've planted local native species, things that are on the list for the Coastal Reserve in the management plan. We hold monthly working bees like many other land care groups to support these plant communities until they're self-sustaining. And I would say most of what we do is weeding. Our volunteers are locals who care about the natural values of the reserve and want to contribute to them. I did a bit of study a few years ago and I interviewed members of our Landcare group and I said, well, why do you come? And it was interesting to me to find out that some come because they want to learn about the plants and the habitat, but others come because they want to get to know their neighbours. And in terms of satisfaction and being part of a Landcare group, it can be very nice to spend time with people that share your deepest values. Some of us have come from John Manowski's talk. you know, those moral and ethical things that drive us in our work and keep us going when we're tired. You know, it's about spending time with people that are on the same page as you sometimes. And Landcare is an opportunity to do that. Oh yes, our long road. This conference is about restoration. And we know it's not an overnight thing. Again, John's talk this morning, you know, we've talked 20, 40, 50, 100 years to re-establish mature trees and nesting hollows. So it's a very long road. We think finished work at one site, and that site now consists of mature trees that don't require ongoing intervention. And the two current sites are what are sort of works in progress. One was first planted in 2004. And notably at that time, my daughter was quite small and she used to get worried about getting lost in the grass. Now the grass is much shorter, the grass is more diverse, the grass is more native. The other we started planting in 2012. The second one we started planting in 2012 was part of a Commonwealth Biodiversity Grant. And there were 7 other local landcare groups that worked in with us. The grant was specifically about threatened species. The one that we identified was the Atlas moth, Atticus wardii. And excitingly, in this last good wet season we've had, one of those moths had been sighted in Stuart Park, one of the suburbs just down the road from here. It's also been seen at Shoal Bay and Dundee on either side of the harbour. So we're hoping that bringing the forest back and bringing the food plants back for that moth, one day we'll see a moth there. But, you know, people say, well, what about, have you seen the moth? And for me, the moth is a bit like icing on a cake. You know, it's the revegetation and bringing back things like the owls is the cake. If we got a moth as well, that'd be great. Chances are an owl would take the moth, but anyway, we'll just work with that. So this brings me to the challenges. And some of these will be common for any land carers who are in the audience today. And some of the challenges are unique to Northern Australia. First one I wanted to talk about is weeds. At an on-site education event that we ran in 2019, we invited a couple of local experts. Darwin is a rich place when it comes to ecology and experts. We're very fortunate there. We've got some friends in those circles. Those 3 people went for a walk and they came back with more than 20 species of weeds, which we laid out on a map, which was very sort of sobering to see how many they were. Some of these weeds are highly invasive and weeds of national significance, such as gamba, and others are garden escapees like the Brazilian joyweed, Alternanthera, I think, Brazilian joyweed, lovely pink leaf, one that my next door neighbour in Tiwi keeps cultivating, but you know, it's also in the reserve. And as far as our landcare group, we tackle weeds a bit like triage in a hospital emergency department. So we start with the game changers, the weeds that are going to produce a fuel load that will kill all other vegetation if it burns. Gamba grass is top of this list, and beneath it are several other species that also make major contributions to the fuel fire load at the sites. Then there's a range of smaller grasses, vines that can smother small and mid-sized trees like calopo and centro, and burrs that puncture people's bicycle tyres and thongs. In this picture here, on the right is one of our very long-standing members who's recently flown away to the central coast of New South Wales, and we're still sad about that. But Louise is standing next to the only gamba plant that we found at our coastal site. It's not fully grown, and you can see that's a real size to over there. You get some idea of how high they can grow, and you can imagine how they take fire up into the canopy. On the left is a picture of my daughter, who's now 22, but she comes back from Adelaide and visits, and she still comes to Landcare, which I find, you know, I'm pretty happy about that. I thought I might have completely put her off Landcare and getting dirty and sweaty, but she does come and join us sometimes. She and the other woman in the picture are working on some of those smothering vines that will take over. Little things, centro and calopo, but in amongst and sitting next to the 2 women there are some Melaleuca leucodendra. In the background of that shot, you can see some very big trees, and they're the paperbarks. So this is around the paperbark swamp. There's some little trees, honestly, 5 centimetres. So if those vines smother them, they're not going to get up. So they're doing some quite intensive work. And, you know, just to reference Pauline's point, rangers do not have an opportunity to do that. So as the Landcare Group, we're helping with the succession. I need to talk a bit faster. I'll show you a map.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, parks, with the support from the Landcare Group, are now considering how interested people might adopt a spot in the reserve. And in their adopting a spot, they might deal with the outliers that show up on this map. Parks resources are not able to do the sort of intensive work that individuals can. And this new framework may be another way that the community and parks can work together to support and enhance the natural values of this much loved reserve. So, this was at the end of one of our weed days, just to get the ute load on the back is some of what we collected that day, which was seed heads off Ceneralata, the candle bush, which we also have in the reserve. Okay, fire. The top end has an extended dry season and the reserve has areas with very high fuel loads. This potential tinderbox was lit 27 times. You saw how small the area is. It was lit 27 times in 2019, with most of these fires being arson and only a few being controlled burns that were set by the rangers to protect assets. Successive arson attacks on our revegetation site in the sand dunes has convinced us to request that parks include it in their controlled burn program. The group's good work on weed management over many years means much of the grass cover on this site is native spear grass. And that's what you can see behind. And if not for the risk of arson, we would leave this to mulch down. However, due to the risk of arson, we brush cut the grass and then rake all the material away from each tree. No mulch, we can't do it. We'd love to, but we can't. Rangers obtain a permit from fire and emergency services, and then subject to the right weather and wind conditions, late one afternoon, we burn around the trees. Our burn for 2021 is set for Tuesday next week. At the other site, we reduce the load of dry fuel by selective weeding and maintain a wide fire break to enable easy access for emergency vehicles. In 2019, Rapid Creek Landcare Group and our neighbours at Rapid Creek set up a meeting of police, rangers, fire and emergency services to develop a more proactive and coordinated approach to mitigating the damage of fire in Casuarina Coastal Reserve. This high-level meeting of responsible government agencies and 2 Landcare groups resulted in a range of strategies to improve the prospects of protecting Casuarina Coastal Reserve. With the approaching dry season, Landcarers are again hoping to build on these initiatives. We take every opportunity to ask visitors to the reserve to call 000 if they ever see an unattended fire. Lastly, people. These are the people who helped us do some infill planting in 2019. Darwin has a highly transitory population, which is a special challenge for groups that rely on volunteers. Our membership includes a few people that have been land caring for more than 20 years and others that are new. There are always people coming and going, and we're greatly reliant on our Facebook site, Landcare NT, and word of mouth to maintain and make progress at the sites we manage. As you know, there's enormous enjoyment to be had by spending time in the bush, and we find that contributing to its well-being is a challenge that's worth meeting. Thank you.